Okay, let's start inshallah ta'ala, and those who miss something, they can always watch the recorded session. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll pick up where we left off last time, and we were talking about certain basics that we have to have before we even approach the discussion of Aqeedah. We defined Aqeedah, why we need it, that it is a point of view in life, and that our actions are related to or depend on how we view life, regardless whether we believe in the existence of God or not. Both of them are points of view in life, and how that impacts our behavior, and how our behavior is impacted by the beliefs that we carry about life and how the way we view life. I made a statement last time about, erroneously, saying that the math is all theoretical. It is actually, that was an incorrect statement. Not all math is theoretical. Some of it is practical, or what they call applied math, and some of it is not. So I apologize for the mistake, and may Allah Ta'ala reward the one who corrected me with it. And this just brings me to the next item, or before I go into the topic. I mean, I have my notes in front of me, but at the same time, I speak sort of off the top of my head, and sometimes, but even if I was reading my own notes verbatim and word by word, it's still there's always a subject of error, and that's why we always, have to check each other. We always have to advise each other. So if you hear something that is incorrect, I will be more than happy to stand corrected and to fix what I made, the mistake that I made. Because the last thing that any of us should want, definitely I don't want it, is to walk around with the wrong idea, thinking that it is the right idea, or that to think that I did not make mistakes in that session, and it turned out that I did. So it's just, we need to be, conscious of this, and may Allah Ta'ala forgive our shortcomings. So now we discussed the universe and what's under our senses, and we talked about everything that falls under our senses. And if we want to discuss where all of this originated from, I said there are certain basic principles, basic intellectual, rational foundations that human beings have that we need to utilize to judge reality. Because what we have is just the world that we sense within our five senses. We sense the existence of certain things, and now we need to discuss, we need to think, we need to analyze whatever we are sensing to know whether these are eternal, whether they always existed, whether they existed at some point. We need to understand the reality that we are living in and the world that we are experiencing. So when we think of them, I mean, when we think about these things that we sense, we are now, the question is, what kind of thinking are we going to use? There are different types of thinking, and I will discuss that inshallah ta'ala in detail in the detailed series that comes after this one. But just to say that what we are going to do is to take the most basic intellectual arguments that the human being has, which all human beings in reality, in practicality, they all agree with, which is what I am calling the fundamental intellectual principles, the innate intellectual principles, the foundations of thinking that all human beings, all thinking human beings have. So this is something that these are things that human beings do have, they do share, and they do not need proofs. And they themselves, they serve the basis in the way that we deal with life. So for example, and I mentioned some examples last time. So for example, I mentioned that, for example, that causality. that when we have something that starts, when I see that something that just started, automatically I have to think, how did it start? Who started that? It must have something that made it. If I see something in an object in my hand, the first thing that comes to mind is, how did this come about? And this is not something that can be in practicality, can be disagreed on. If you see a water leak, you know, you automatically say, okay, where did this water come from? Which pipe is broken? When you see a puddle of oil under your car, immediately start inspecting the oil, you know, container, and start saying, okay, that must have a hole, some leak somewhere, because the presence of the oil reflects that there is a leak from the car that allows this to come down. So it is just natural, it is innate, it does not need, you know, to be proven that it exists. All human beings in practicality do it. Even children, if you have a child and you tap him on the back of his head, immediately he will turn around, because for him that tap did not come from nowhere. Somebody must have created it, something must have initiated it, and therefore, okay, who did it? And even a child who did not go to school, who did not, you know, still a child, a baby, when you do that to him and you tell him nothing, nobody touched you, immediately they will feel that you are lying or misleading them. Why? Because it is innate to the human being that if something occurs, you know, something that, you know, must have made it occur. Now, the same thing, there's certain, these things don't require proofs. So it's innate in the human being. If I carry 10 pounds, you know, do you think I can carry 5? You tell me, well, prove it. I just carry 10 pounds. I don't need to prove to you that I can carry 5 if I carry 10, given that everything is constant. You know, everything, nothing is changing in the equation. You know, if you see me carrying 10 pounds, automatically you have to know for a fact, a matter of fact, that I can carry 5. What prevents me from carrying 5 if I carried 10? So the heavier weight means that I can carry the lighter weight. You know, this is something, again, it exists. The idea of, if the whole is bigger than the part. Two contradicting things cannot exist at the same time. You know, I cannot tell you are here but not here. It does not make sense. I cannot tell you you're alive but you're dead. Or somebody, you know, says, well, so and so passed away. I said, no, he's alive. You know, but he passed away. But he must be alive. You know, that kind of argument, no sane human beings carry it, because this is innate in the human being. And when I say innate, I mean it is universal. And it is not something that is taught. You don't go to school to learn that the whole is bigger than the part, or the two is bigger than one. It is, children understand it. If you're distributing, you know, a candy, and you give one child a piece of candy and you give the second child 2, the first child will look at you, why are you unfair? You know, immediately the idea even of fairness exists, but the idea also that the one is smaller than the 2, is less than the 2, is something that is innate in that human being. These, again, do not require learning. They do not require education. They are part of the human being. When I say part, I don't mean an integral part of the makeup of the human being. Actually, they are something that exists whether the human being exists or not. So if I believe that, if I carry these ideas, whether I die or I don't, these ideas remain valid. These principles remain valid, that the half is smaller than the whole, that two contradicting statements cannot, you know, about the same object or the same item cannot hold true. So this is, again, this is the educated people do it. This is ill-educated people do it. Non-educated people at all do it. They do it in China, they do it in France, they do it in the Middle East, they do it in America, they do it worldwide, because it has nothing to do with where, who. As long as you are a sane human being, these things exist with you. And of course, you know, I am emphasizing this because without establishing this foundation, you can never establish anything else. You can never establish anything else. Even the idea, you know, even though some scientists might dispute this in theory. That no, we do not take any assumptions, any basics of fundamental thought. We actually have to experiment everything. But actually, in reality, science is also based on certain assumptions and certain premises, and that science cannot exist without them. The way that you, for example, one of the laws that governs science, one of the premises, or one of the assumptions that they start with science is that the world, the universe, is governed by laws. How do you know the world is governed by laws? You did not, the universe, you did not examine the entire universe. You examined a subsection of the universe, a section of the universe. So to assume that the rest of the universe, based on your to induce from the reality that you witnessed or that you experimented with, that the world is based on or is governed by laws, is actually based on assumptions, not a matter of experiment. You did not experiment the entire universe to reach that conclusion, yet it's an established premise, it's an established foundation for any scientific study. You cannot go forward without it. So that is one. The second one, that it is that the universe, another assumption among scientists, in the scientific method, is that it can be learned. The universe, whatever that you're discovering, it can be learned, it can be studied. And again, that's an assumption, because certain things, can, and that you are under your senses, but you are automatically assuming that therefore it applies to the others. I'm saying the foundations, the principles of knowledge, the principles of the assumptions that you start with, this is common with everybody and in every field. So actually, just in and these principles, by the way, are, again, they are detached from ourselves. They are separate from the making of the human being, yet they are innate in terms of that each human being possesses that kind of these basic principles. So along these lines, there was a debate between Frank Turek, who wrote the book Stealing from God, and an atheist. And this was after Frank Turek, he's a professor. He gave a talk in the university in Wisconsin, and an atheist came after the lecture and asked him, and they were discussing, and basically the atheist says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he expressed doubts about whether there was this basic fundamental principles of thought that exist universally amongst all people. So Professor Turek said, so you do believe in these principles, or these foundations, the fundamentals of thought, these basic principles that all human beings know? He said, I don't know how you understood this from what I just said. No, I don't believe in them. He said, but you actually do believe in them. He said, I don't believe in them. Now the man is irritated. I told you I don't believe in them. He said, the reality that you're not accepting to have a belief in and not a belief in, a disbelief in about the same subject, actually is applying those principles, basic principles of thought that human beings have, that you cannot have contradiction regarding the same subject matter. One, you say he's alive and he's dead at the same time. You believe and you don't believe at the same time. That's what I'm saying. Theoretically, you might have people who tell you there is no such principles, but they themselves, when it comes to applying those principles, or to studying, to analyzing, they apply them, without much thought. They're just innate and they are applied naturally. Similarly, by the way, Lawrence Krauss, in his book Universe from Nothing, of course, he says exactly what the title is saying, that universe from nothing. And by that, he is actually debating or trying to refute the idea of causality, that nothing exists, nothing starts, nothing starts without something initiating it. So, and this is, of course, now when we say nothing starts, because they're referring the universe as at large, and the universe now with the prominence of the Big Bang Theory, pretty much all scientists agree that the universe started, at some point. Okay, and inshallah ta'ala, when we talk about these theories in details in the second series, we will address them actually, and to see where the limitations of them and what they mean, what they imply, etc. But now, just to say that they agree on the idea that the universe started. So for Lawrence Krauss, he views that okay, the universe started itself. So now David Albert, who is a physicist, wrote a review of his book in the New York Times, and he called "On the Origin of Everything." Look at the flip of the title. Cross's book is "Universe from Nothing," and Albert's book is "The Origin of Everything." So he mentioned, Cross mentions that the laws of mechanics created the universe. How did the universe come to be? Laws of mechanics. Okay, so Albert says before where, for starters, in the laws of quantum mechanics themselves supposed to have come from. And that's a physicist answering Cross, saying, well, for starters, where are if you say that the laws created the universe, well, where did the laws come from? Okay, and this is again using the idea of causality and the idea of something else that we'll talk about, which is the idea of a system that governs the universe. When you say laws, set of rules that created the universe, the very basic question which comes from, you don't have to be a physicist to ask this question, and that's my point why I'm emphasizing this subject. You don't have to be a physicist to answer it, is to say the natural question, there are laws, well, who imposed them? Who made such laws? Who organized these rules in such a way, or organized these items, these objects, this cosmos, the universe, to function in a certain way according to certain rules? And that's exactly what the physicist responded. And where to start, where did these rules come from? And because it is negating the idea of causality, is just against the very human nature, the very basics of thinking, and you cannot really even in science, you cannot go far without using these ideas to judge and to manage your science discoveries, etc. Okay, now I'm saying that we are supposed to address the universe and what's under our senses, from an intellectual point of view that's related to our senses, meaning the most basic thought, the most fundamental thought that exists and common amongst all human beings. Okay, now but of course nowadays the major way of thinking that is most dominant and most used, of course, is the scientific way of thinking, or scientism, that everything has to be subject of experimentation, that we have to experiment with everything for us to know that it is a matter of fact. Okay, and this is, of course, there is absolutely nothing for me to critique or to criticize the scientific way of thinking, but to say, and we, alhamdulillah, Muslims, we never had a problem actually with the scientific way of thinking, or the idea of science, and we never had the conflict between Islam or the beliefs in Islam, the rational proofs Islam presents for its Aqeedah, and the science. And Muslims in their time, through history, when they progressed with Islam, of course, they contributed tremendously to science, and this is common knowledge. But the idea here is that where does the scientific way of thinking exist, and how much we stretch it? Again, the details of it, inshallah ta'ala, in the next series. But now we want to just take the quick and the obvious. The quick and the obvious is that when we talk about experimentation, talk about the scientific approach, this is dealing with tangibles. Actually, this is part of the problem. They will tell you, I cannot reach that there is a God, there is a creator, because I cannot examine him. I cannot examine the God. So if I cannot examine God, he's not in my lab for me to test, I cannot determine that he's God or not. Okay, and that's literally what it is. So it is the scientific way of thinking is good for tangibles. But it is beyond the tangibles, the intangibles. It's not able to explain. So, for example, can science explain history? Can science explain the concept of yesterday? Aside for our cycles, or can it explain the idea of history? The idea of emotions, such as affection. honesty, dignity, beauty. And when we, by the way, the idea of beauty in itself, is something that even Darwinism and the theory of Darwinism has the obstacle of something called beauty. And when we discuss Darwinism, inshallah ta'ala, we'll see how the idea of beauty itself is a major obstacle in the explanation that Darwin introduced to in his theory. But the idea is that, can science pass judgment on beauty? Can it pass judgment on dignity, on honor, on sacrifice? These ideas, they are not tangible objects for them to be put under science, yet all of us as human beings acknowledge, as a matter of fact, that they exist. We do understand something called history, and we study it, and events in the past. We understand affection beyond the chemical reaction or the biochemical reaction that takes place in the body when there is an infection. But the idea that the feeling of it, the honesty, dishonesty, the dignity, the feeling of being in awe of beauty, these things, how can science, judge them? So it cannot judge. For example, if I take the Mona Lisa, and Mona Lisa is probably the most famous painting in the world, painted by Leonardo da Vinci. So he painted this Mona Lisa, and for reasons I don't understand art, but they determine, the artists and the people who understand art and how it should be, etc. They pass judgment that this is like no other, and it's fine. I'll take their word. Okay, but what can science do with this painting? Science can come and say, well, what is it made of? Oh, it's on a campus, or it is on wood. Is it painted with oil, or is it painted with crayons? What was it painted on? Okay, well, let me run some tests, and I say, okay, well, this was in the 16th century. That's what, based on the study of the paint and the study of the material that's made of, I can give you an estimate. Even an exact science, go an exact date, in the early 16th century, and it's fine. But okay, how much is it worth for science? Tell you, probably if you put all the material together, probably about $300. You can go and buy it, and you can make it. But is this really the judgment that you pass on the Mona Lisa, when its actual worth in 2018, it was about $830 million? And that's an estimate, etc. But the idea is, it is in the millions of dollars, and you're talking about a minor, a small part. How can science judge, the beauty of the Mona Lisa? How can it judge to say that this is beauty? What criteria, what scientific method they can use to reach such conclusion? So what I'm saying is, science is good in its place, and it becomes injustice to science and everybody else when we take science outside of its domain, outside of its realm, and try to apply it across the board, because it is not the same. It does not apply there. And we will come to them, inshallah ta'ala, again, when we discuss the scientific way of thinking and its limitations, with morality, with ethics, with beauty, it falls short on many ways, and it would be unjust to take it out of its realm and superimpose it in everywhere else. So what are we going to use? We are going to use the rational, intellectual approach, that's based on our senses, using the most basic, fundamental notions in the human being, the principles of thinking in the human being, that for us to pass judgment on the existence of the universe and whatever's under our senses. So before I start with the idea of the existence of God, anybody has any question, or please don't hesitate. Any questions, or should I continue? Okay, then I'll continue, inshallah ta'ala, and towards the end we will come back to see if there are questions. And if anybody misses it, if you don't get to ask your questions, just post them, inshallah ta'ala, and somebody will get back to you. Okay. So let's start the discussion of the proof of the creation. Well, what I want to start with actually is the first item for the proof of creation or creator, that there is somebody who designed, who created that everything that exists, and that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is by going back to these fundamental principles of thought that I was talking about. Who originated them? Who made them? Because where did they come from? If they're not innate, in other words, if I cut my arm, not part of them will go off. If it's who made such standards of thinking where that are universal across every culture, every place in the world, every generation. They endure time, place, space, and you find that these basic universal rationales, these givens, that they are shared by all human beings at different ages, expressed in different ways. But where did they come from? Well, some people said that, well, if you say that the world was formed as an accident, it does not address where these came from. Accident or no accident, it's still where did they come from. And I'm saying that these things were given to the human being. Were given to the human being as a set of standards, and they are definitely common amongst all thinking human beings, from scientists to the regular people like ourselves. And these are not something that is taught. These are something not that you learn. These are practiced by children. If you are dividing money amongst unlettered workers, simply by you saying, okay, $2 for you, $1 for you, immediately, the one who, why am I getting less? Even though the person might be an unlettered person, but that knowledge is innate, that knowledge is fundamental, and that knowledge is something that is extra or external to the human being. Where was it acquired from? How is it introduced to all human beings? So that the existence of these fundamental principles of thinking, these that are not disputed, and they are absolute in their conclusion, because you cannot be in two places at the same time. You are either here or there. You are either alive or dead. You are, there is either, if there is fire or there is smoke, there is fire that's introducing it or about to start, but that there is a cause. If you see, etc., etc. Okay, so the first thing is the very presence, the very existence of these fundamental, principles of thinking that exist with the human beings show that they were introduced, they were given to the human being. Okay. The second thing is the idea of creationism, again relying on the same principles that we used. So we know that, for example, that everything around us has a start. Now again, and I'm not going to go deep into the issue of the universe and how it started, but now again, even amongst scientists and amongst atheists, pretty much everybody agrees that the universe started at some point. And there are several things, and actually they even estimated the age of the universe, right? It's about 13.7, 13.8 billion years. So, and they measured how they measured its time, etc. All of that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll discuss in details later. But the idea is that they all are in agreement, pretty much all in agreement, that it started at some point. The idea that the universe is expanding, the idea is it's expanding. So if it's expanding, it's growing. And this, again, it's a matter of fact. Everybody agrees on it. The universe is expanding continuously and keeps expanding and expanding. So in other words, today it's smaller than tomorrow. Yesterday is smaller than today, and the day before yesterday is smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's going to go back to what? It's going to go back to the singularity that they are talking about. They're going to talk about, again, going back to the point of nothing, where a starting point, it started, and then the addition or the expansion started. So when you have that knowledge that you have human beings, we know that human beings started at some point. And again, the idea of the Darwin's theory should not come to play, because Darwin was not in the business of explaining how life originated or how the universe came to be. Darwin was in the business of how man came to be the way they are, from whether it's from a single cell or from that process, whether through natural selection or a mutation or that inshallah ta'ala we'll discuss, but it does not address the existence or the starting of life. It exists the development of life, if you wish. So, but the idea that everything had a start, human beings had a start, life had a start, and life, as I said, it's sensed in the living organisms, and the universe, everybody pretty much agrees that it has a start. And if it is so, then again back to those principles of knowledge, principles of thought, when we say that anything that starts must have been started by something else. Why? Because you cannot break the idea of the contradiction of not existing and existing at the same time. So the idea of causality, you cannot have something without a cause. You cannot have something getting initiated without something initiating it. You cannot be not there and then make yourself. How can you make yourself if you're not there? If this is the case, then if everything has a starting point, then automatically what? Then somebody must have started it. And that is what we say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a creator, the one who made all of this come from the point of nothing to the point of something. Okay, and that inshallah ta'ala, we'll discuss it a bit more inshallah in maybe tonight if we get the time. Okay, but the idea is, the basic principle is that if something started at some point, something must have started it. Okay, nothing starts without a cause. The principle of causality applies here, and therefore, it's a proof that there is a founder or an initiator of all that started. And the idea again that some scientists such as Cross presents about a universe from nothing, again it is refuted, and you have people who actually said, I don't even know, one physicist, he said, I don't even know what he was thinking when he wrote this. And similar statements were made by other scientists about Dawkins with his book about the God delusion, and we'll come to them inshallah ta'ala later on. But so this is the second proof about the existence of the creator. The first is the fundamental thought, or the foundations of thought, natural thought that exists in the human being. And the second is the fact that everything has a start. Automatically it means somebody must have started it. Now the third item or the third point is the idea of that there is what they call the fine-tuning of the universe. That when we look, and again we're looking still under our senses, when we look at what's under our senses, we look at the sun, we look at the moon, we look at the planets, we look at the orbits, we look at the four seasons, we look at the day, we look at the night, we look at the rain, what causes it and what it does. We look at the water, wind. You see that all of them are interdependent, and there is a relationship amongst them, and that they work in harmony. They work in harmony, where the sun is the center, and then the moon and the planets orbit it, and of course from amongst them is the earth, and then that generates a set of events that take place, whether it is the seasons or the day and night, all of these things, all these events that take place, all result from the way the sun is, where the moon is, the fact that the moon has light reflected from the sun, the fact that the sun has the light that's generated and emitted to the world, the distance between the sun and the moon, the distance between the sun and the earth, all of these things, are set in such a way that they work together. So for example, if we change any of them, such as the law of gravity, such as the distance between the sun and the earth, the sun and the moon, between the, you automatically, life not only would be changed, but actually it might be completely gone. So, and we'll talk about it inshallah ta'ala a bit more, but look, if there's a difference between finding a subject, an object, and then finding something fine-tuned and something that is beautified and made an object. So for example, if you look at the Grand Canyon, versus Mount Rushmore, right? The Mount Rushmore, of course, has the four presidents' faces, on the rocks, right? So if you go to the Grand Canyon and you see the paths and you see the valleys and you see this and that, automatically you can say, okay, I can understand rain poured, between the rain and the heat and between the wind, etc. These tunnels were formed and these valleys were formed, these paths were formed, etc. But when you look at Mount Rushmore and you look at faces of people, it doesn't matter who, but automatically you can say that this had a maker. This is not something that's caused at random. This is not something that's caused by sun, by moon, etc. This is something actually somebody crafted. And let me just drive it one more step. It's a skilled maker. For somebody to be able to take these huge rocks and actually imprint faces on them, and which resemble the reality, you automatically say that it's not only just a maker, it is a skilled maker. It is somebody who's able to do this, So that's the given reality, is that this complexity in the making requires a person who is on the level of that complexity. So whether I mean, this is the first natural reaction that you take based on the idea of cause and effect, that you do not see such a thing and you say, well, it was maybe the wind blew it. The wind blew it, maybe it will move a rock from here to there. The sun hit it, a rock maybe will fall. The rain will make a hole in the rock, but it's not going to give you faces. It's not going to give you faces. And we are now, if we're standing there and we're looking at them, we did not witness the making of them, but we know somebody at some point made them. And why? Because again, they are the complexity of what is taking place automatically show that. And now when we look at the universe, we reach the same conclusion about them. So if we measure the distance between the sun and the earth, right? It's about 92 million miles, from the sun. Well, how about if that changes? What kind of impact it will have on the world? And of course, the answer is given. Not only that, even when we did not take care of the earth, as nowadays, I mean, just today, I believe that there was the report from the United Nations about the global warming and what is happening to the world because of the way that the standing civilization actually treated the earth. It treated it literally as something that is disposable rather than something that needs to be looked after. And then you find that now we're talking about the floods, and we're talking about hurricanes, and you're talking about all kinds of an atmosphere that they say that by literally within this century, many parts of the world might be where you cannot live in these areas. But the point is here is that this is the system that was put in place. This is the way that the complexity of the earth, the complexity of the earth in relationship with other planets, etc. The same thing with gravity. Actually, the New Scientist published an article in it when it talks about gravity, and it says that the feebleness of gravity is something we should be grateful for. If it were a tiny bit stronger, none of us would be here to scoff at it, at its puny nature. literally a tiny bit of gravity, because the gravity is not only impacting you, the walking on the earth or building or having your car run, but also gravity is within the universe and the other planets. If gravity was heavier, stronger, the world, the universe, or the planets are going to collapse into each other. And if it is weaker, they are going to start dispensing, separating more than they need to, and that will lead to what will lead to destruction again and absence of life. This is just about the laws of the universe. But now, and by the way, as I mentioned, when scientists actually start their scientific journey, they start their scientific journey looking for those laws. The idea that, as I said, it's a premise, it's the assumption that the universe is it's structured by laws. That's what scientists do. And that's, you'll find, by the way, before now, the Darwinism and even before Darwinism, but the idea of atheism becoming more common, most of the scientists were actually religious people, because actually what drove them to look into science, actually they were in the pursuit of God's law. They were looking for God's law in the universe, and it's that was the motivator for them. Okay, now of course it's a different issue, but the point is, when we think of the struggle between the Catholic Church and scientists, etc., it is limited to a certain scenario. It's not that every scientist or every believer was automatically non-participant in science. Actually, it was exactly the opposite. Okay, and the other part of it, before I just make some remarks, the other part of it is that this universe, when it was made, and with all these relationships with this all interchanged and interdependencies that exist amongst them, amongst the universe and its components and the human being, etc., they are at the service for the human, at the service of the living organisms. In other words, and this is my fourth point, is that what they call in Arabic al-inaya, qanun al-inaya, that the proof or the law of caring, that this universe is made for the service of the human being. Look at it's really especially for the human being. You look at when we talked about the sun and the moon and the water, look at the cycle of life. Look at how the water impacts the plants, how the sun and where it is impacts the water. How the moon impacts the rise of the oceans, how the wind impacts the pollination of plants, how the existence of things that we can eat, whether it is plants or animals that we can eat, how the water has to be the right water for us to drink. The air has to be within a certain standards of pollution, a certain standards of combination of things for us to be able to breathe them. All of this is structured, set up to support the life of the human being. So in other words, when you have a system working together for a certain specific goal, automatically you will say there is a maker for it, there is an initiator for it, because not just a system even at random, a system and let everything else dies. It's actually a system to make everything live and function and serve each other. So we're supposed to function in a certain way, and that's how the universe is made, for our service, for so everything that's in it, it works together to provide a certain atmosphere that enables life, enables the sustenance of life, it enables the sustenance, the sustaining of life. It enables the human being to function and to live and to thrive, etc., etc. So the fact that there is a system that's geared towards certain goals, automatically you will say that this is set by a designer, set by a maker, by a creator. It is exactly when you see the difference between a rock and a watch. and that's why they have this as one of the arguments. I really don't like, especially not in this series, to go into labeling arguments and giving it this academic view, because really it should not be. Aqidah should never be studied as some bunch of academics and just intellectual mumbo jumbo. It should be something that deals with life, and we solve it. We address the Aqidah, we reach a conclusion, then we go about the consequence of this Aqidah, which is how do you live? Because at the end of the day, this is how you live and how you should structure your life. It's not just some academic random ideas. This scientist refutes this scientist, and this theory counters this theory. This is, they are like that because they are not based on the basic principles of thought that we talked about. Those principles that cannot go wrong. If they were applied, if these principles were applied, then we would not have all of this variations, and we will address that inshallah ta'ala. But the idea here, they talk about the watchmaker. That's the theory of the watchmaker, that's what they call it. So the idea, if you see a rock on the floor, you can say, well, it's a rock, it could have, I don't know, came from everywhere. But when you see a watch on the floor, and you see now there is the minute hand, and there's a second hand, and there is the dates are flipping, and every 24 hours you see the date flipping, for another day. You see the PM and AM, you see it with the sunset, and you see it with the sunrise. Automatically you cannot be a sane person who applies the basic principles of thought about the cause and effect, and the idea of and not pass a judgment that somebody made the watch. It cannot exist on its own. And this is what we are talking about when we talk about the greatness of the complexity, the systematic presence and structure of the universe and its surroundings. And then on top of it, you see it all working with the human being, for the benefit of the human being, for the benefit of life, etc. You cannot but reach a conclusion that somebody made that system. Okay, so for Dr. Paul Davis, he's a noted author and professor of theoretical physics in Adelaide University. So look at what he says about this idea. He says the really amazing thing is not that life on earth is balanced on a knife edge. That's not the amazing thing, that life on earth is balanced on a knife edge, but that the entire universe is balanced on a knife edge and would be total chaos if any of the natural constants were off very slightly. It's not just that the life on earth is balanced on a knife edge, but the entire universe. When you say the entire universe with all its laws, with all its components, they are also on a knife edge, and would be total chaos if any of the natural constants were off even slightly. He continues, he says, even if you dismiss man as a chance happening, and that is a huge chance really for it to happen, but if you dismiss man as a chance happening, the fact remains that the universe seems unreasonably suited for the existence of life, almost contrived. You might say a put-up job, end of quote. You might say a put-up job. Somebody put this thing up for you. Okay, this is of course a scientist. And by the way, when we talk about this, he after all of this, he really introduced observation of reality, and he introduced the natural, the basic thought that any human being, any rational human being will come to with. This is the basic thought, fundamental thought that we all have. And the same conclusion, by the way, the same conclusion, which is what is in our culture, Islamic culture, when they talk about the Bedouin, when they asked him, how did you believe in God? How do you believe in God? He said, well, he said, al-ba'ratu tadullu al-ba'ir. He said, the camel waist shows that there was a camel. When you see waist, camel waist, you don't see a camel, you just see the camel waist. He said, there was a camel, because this is camel waist. وَأَثَرُ الْخُطَى يَدُلُّ عَلَى الْمَسِيرِ. And you see a footprint, automatically it will show you that somebody walked here. This is a footprint, so somebody must have walked here. أَفَسَمَاءٌ ذَاتُ أَبْرَاجٍ. So when you look at the sky with all its, sky, the sky with its stars, وَأَرْضٌ ذَاتُ ثُجَاجٍ, and the earth with all of its the water flowing, etc. أفلا يدل على لطيف الخبير. Don't they show somebody who is very meticulous in the making and very expert at what they made? It's very simple. This shows this shows a camel, this shows somebody walked. Now with all of this complexity of the universe, don't they show that somebody who's also complex, somebody who's also most capable and expert in what they said? This is the natural conclusion that you can come up to. And that's why what I meant to say, when I said that we do not only talk about the existence of the creator, we are talking about a creator who created all of this sophisticated, systematic, this sitting on a knife edge, kind of setup, the interdependencies, the complexity, without even going to the human being. We're just talking about this general outside looking at the world. That will automatically require that he subhanahu wa ta'ala is alim, is knowledgeable, is powerful, is capable, is able to do what he wants, etc., etc. All of these, some of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala come from the fact of his creation, that he is alive, that he is living, because the living is what makes, not the absent, not when he's absent, he cannot make, that he is most capable, that he is powerful, that he is one, because again, the system that the world functions in, and the way that it functions to serve and to present a reality, in a certain reality, shows that there is one will. It does not show multiple wills. And again, we'll discuss this inshallah ta'ala in more detail. So one item left, and I'm going through it fast. One item left, and inshallah ta'ala that we'll conclude tonight. And the item that's left is what? Well, if Allah ta'ala, if the creator, there is a creator who created all of this, then who created the creator? This is something that, of course, when this question, who created the creator? When this question is asked, normally, you ask it when you're debating with people, and you say it's normally really not a question for somebody who believes in God and who's actually asking, well, then how did God come to be? How did this creator come to be? It's somebody who's debating you. Normally somebody who does not believe in God to start with, and to get you to the point of saying, well, if God created God and God created God, so that you continue endlessly putting doubt in your theory, basically, or in your position. So, and in the God Delusion book, actually, that was a central question in this book. Of course, the question actually is based on a wrong premise. The wrong premise that the question is based on is that everything that exists must have a creator, and therefore, if Allah exists, he has to have a creator. So who created God? Who created Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And of course, again, the question is wrong because the premise is wrong. The premise is wrong that everything exists must have a creator. No, everything that is started must have a creator. Everything that is that was not and becomes, or that became, that requires somebody to take it from the nothing to the something. But and therefore, the one who made it cannot be somebody who is made. Why? Well, go back to the very basic thoughts that we talked about the universe, and we talked about how to think. We said that one of the basic fundamental principles of thinking that we have is that there is no contradiction. If you accept the question that he is a maker and he is made at the same time, then you actually let go of the principle of you cannot have a contradiction in the statement. You cannot have him to be eternal, a creator who does not have who created everything, but at the same time he was created by somebody else. Because that's a conflict in the attribute of the creator, that he is in contradiction. He was not, and then he became, but he also made everything else become. So again, the premise is wrong, because it goes to the idea of who that everything that exists has a creator, and this is a wrong premise. It's everything that starts, or everything that is hadith, everything that is made has a maker, not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the creator has a maker. Again, we will go into it inshallah ta'ala in a bit more depth when we talk in the second series inshallah. Any question? The question is, I was speaking to a professor of philosophy, and he said there is no difference between the rational thought and the scientific. But that is not true, is it? Rational thought does not require you to run experiments on everything for you to accept it. Rational thought is that, is it rational thought to say that if you are in need of food, then somebody must have provided for you because you are born and need food, different types of food, different stages of your life, and when you say that you have those, it means somebody provided them for you. How can you prove that scientifically? And again, by the way, there is also the looseness in the concept of, or in the defining the scientific way. And for example, when they say science and experimentation, the scientific way of thinking, normally they tell you that the experiment has to be repeatable. That one way to prove, you need to be able to repeat the experiment. How will you know? Because it can be a fluke, right? It can be an accident. So you need to repeat it. Well, they call Darwinism, Darwin's theory, they call it science. How do you repeat it? How do you repeat the experiment? This is actually the theory, but that's why they call it natural science. So I'm saying they start loosening the definition. Same thing with like psychology. Psychology is the study of the human behavior and the thinking of the human behavior. But it's also the way that they conduct experiments. The human beings might apply to them differently, and then yet they still call it social science, and it falls under science. And then I'm saying they become loose in the definition of the scientific method. But when I say the scientific method in my discussion, I in the strict sense of lab science, what you can actually do in the lab. And that's why many people who use this method, they tell you you can never prove the existence of God because how can I know that he is there if he is not in my lab? Actually, I heard one of them, even though he says he's a Muslim, by the way. He said he's a Muslim, but he's saying, I separate between my faith, quote unquote, and my scientific brain. My science brain tells me that you cannot prove it, even if God himself, look at the way of the messed up way of thinking. Even himself comes to me and tells me that he's God, I will not believe it. Why? How can I prove it? Okay. It's different from the idea of rational thought that which we mentioned, and it's not really what do you call it, the learned thinking or the learned method. So for example, if you learn math, if you learn chemistry, you learn physics, and you go about proving a problem, and the problem is 20 pages long to prove, or to solve a problem, you can make a mistake, and maybe you can even fool me with it because I might have overlooked something. But when we talk about because these are learned sciences, learned processes of thinking. But when we talk about what I was talking about, those fundamental basic principles, these are absolute, and they don't require me to prove it. I don't, if it is silly, any human being will think silly if I tell you, can you carry this 10 pounds? And you say, yep, sure. He goes and he carries it, and then I tell you, can you carry the 5 pounds? He said, yeah, but I gotta try it first. I don't know, I have to try it. This is nonsense. How can you even discuss anything when you think like that? If I need to experiment everything, now we start going in circles, because again, we run into a lot of problems. You cannot prove anything. And when we talk about it, inshallah ta'ala, in detail, we'll get into that. But again, and just in In short, probably maybe he's referring to the idea of the scientific method in a loose way. But inshallah ta'ala, when we discuss it in detail, we'll define it as they define it, as they define the scientific way of thinking, and as they put their requirements to consider this scientific, not scientific way of thinking, and we go with it. But we know that all the discussions that take place now, and you see many debates on YouTube with atheists and believers, and whether Muslims or non-Muslims, but you see all of these debates, etc. Again, it boils down to very basic things, which are if they do not use the principles that we used, you can go all over the place, because there's nothing to guide your thought. There's nothing to guide your analysis. The flaw in the question is in its methodology, saying that things require a creator is based on sensing the world around us or the reality. To ask about the origin of the creator demonstrates that the question thought is being built on the abstract, not what we can rationally assess by way of our senses. That's correct. Also, all knowledge belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He sets the limitations for us. Correct, but the problem, sister, is that and if you notice, now 2 sessions, I don't believe I mentioned a single ayah or a single hadith or a simple, because when we Muslims have a very fundamental problem nowadays. The fundamental problem is really, the causes of it are complex, or let's say multifaceted, multi-dimensional. But the bottom line is that we have absolute ignorance of Islam itself, absolute ignorance of Islam in its aqeedah, in its ahkam, in its rules. This is made worse with the domination and the absolute domination of the Western culture, specifically the American culture, worldwide. And this, by the way, it's not only, the Muslims are suffering from it. Even the quote-unquote Americanism or American culture is, even the French are complaining about, the British are complaining about it, that it's dominated their sphere as well. But I'm saying in the Western culture in general, when the Western culture is the ideas with a capital W, the ideas that are specific to the West in terms of secularism, in terms of liberties and freedoms, in terms of what is right and what's wrong, what's the right way of life, So, and of course, you add to it the very defeated reality of Muslims, and the campaign, the relentless campaign against Islam to demonize it and to make it appear as if it's some evil deen. And this campaign is not by the West alone; it is also with our rulers. So I'm saying it is complicated. It complicates the situation in such a way where you come up to Muslims who tell you I don't know if I believe in God altogether. I don't know if I believe in Islam altogether. And so if for me to say, well, Allah is one, qul huwallahu ahad, it's not going to fly far, because if the origin, if the basis where I use the proof from is not believed in, then it has no value for them. This is one item, and that's why we need to present these as intellectual ideas, so that everybody understands it. Our children and our neighbors and the people who are interested in these subjects, at least they see an answer, they see a direction. And of course, it's once we finish that, of course, we base on it and we build on it. So it is needed, and at the same time, the idea of religion itself, regardless of who believes in it, the idea of religion itself now it's made into as if for silly people, for people who believe in fairy tales and who have absolutely no rationale, nothing to back up their arguments. And that's why they call it faith. And unfortunately, we Muslims are calling our belief system into a faith. And faith is by definition cannot be proven. Why can't we prove it? How did Islam for 1300 years influence the world? By not proving its beliefs, and people entered into the deen of Islam in masses, also without being able to prove it. The lacking is not in the proof, the lack that there is no proof. It's really in us ourselves understanding the challenges of the time and modifying, making our proofs, able to deal with the challenges of the time. So I'm saying we as Muslims have to present, a proper stand regarding our, our belief system and how we reached it. So, this is not just for us, even for non-Muslims, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us all. Any other questions? Okay. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll stop here, so I don't take much longer of your time. And next time, inshallah, we will discuss the idea of messengers and the need for messengers and the Qur'an al-Kareem, or the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And we'll take it from there, inshallah. If you have any questions or any comments, especially for those who did not came either late or they will watch it recorded, just post your question on Facebook, inshallah, and somebody will reply to you. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خير. السلام عليكم.